Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Civic Podcast. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Markus Wagner. Markus, good to see you again.
Likewise, David. How are you?
I'm well. I'm excited that today we'll finally be talking about the topic that I can't seem to stop talking about at the end of each episode, which is artificial intelligence. We'll get onto that in a moment. But before we do, we should give a little bit of a recap or an update on our episode covering the results of the Australian federal election because, well, the dust has cleared and we now have some better idea of the ultimate results of that election, which, as we said on that episode, was a landslide victory for Labor. There's been some rather exciting news on the Australian federal politics front as well, hasn't there, Markus?
There has. So, as most of you know, I've only lived here for about 6-7 years now. Well, at least down here in Australia, the breakup of the coalition registers as a major earthquake and doesn't really make any waves on the Richter scale anywhere else, for that matter. But the coalition that's been together for 38 years and really for much longer, for 80 years before that, with a small break in between, they've decided to split up, and we'll have to see when they make up again and come back together, I think.
Yes. So Markus did text me before we recorded, when we both saw this news at about midday. We said, will anyone, will this even register on a global scale? But for listeners overseas, the coalition is effectively it has been a long-standing institution in Australian federal and indeed in Australian state politics as well. And they really are the alternative government to the Labor Party. ABC's election analyst Anthony Green, who covered his last election but is still working away at the ABC for the time being, did say in the last 2 hours there is just no way that either the Liberals or the Nationals could ever form government on their own. So it does leave the country in, kind of wondering who is the alternative party of government if not a coalition. And I think you're right, Markus. It's easy to get excited about this news because it does seem historic and groundbreaking here in Australia. We don't know much about the reasons for the breakup, but it does sound like it's another battle in the war for the soul of the Liberal Party, really. It sounds like new Liberals Party leader Susan Ley and Nationals Party leader David Littleproud were unable to find common ground on a number of key policy issues for the Nationals, including continuing to back nuclear energy as an energy policy, antitrust, or what we call in Australia competition, law investigations, and perhaps a forced breakup of the two major supermarket chains. Big issue for the Nationals Party, which represents in sort of its caucus farmers, rural and regional people who work in primary industries, and who have long thought that their primary customer, the supermarkets, have had a bit too much power. So that is perhaps some of the reasons why the breakup has happened. Of course, Markus, you said 2 periods of time, which is important to pay attention to here. The coalition has existed in its current form for 38 years, and as an institution in Australian politics generally for about 80. But 38 years ago, in 1987, there was a previous breakup of the coalition. It was a little skirmish between the Liberals and the Nationals. But of course, they came back together again to contest a federal election. We're 3 years out from the next federal election. It seems like the safest time to have this little breakup before coming back together.
Look, I come from a country in which I'm very comfortable with smaller parties, and I frankly don't like the notion of having the opposition because it makes them far bigger than they are. And in this particular instance, it certainly would. I just think coalitions, no matter how they form, are a healthy way of governing. So we won't have that for a long time. But the other thing I think we need to mention is what happened with Labor. And yes, Labor has this resounding win, I think 93 out of 150 at this point seats, despite only having 1/3 of the vote. But the one thing that happened last week is that 2 of the ministers on the front bench had basically been sacked because of internal party machinations between what in Australia you call the factions and the factional infighting. And David, I don't know what your take on this is, but my own take initially was someone like Ed Husic, a relatively young member of parliament. I can sort of see that he has a long future ahead of himself. Mark Dreyfus, long sort of standing, almost sort of patrician type politician, the epitome of an attorney general, if ever there is one, was sacked without and would not have run for his seat, presumably, and was sacked ex post. That, I think, left a bad taste in many people's mouth, whether you like the policies and politics of Mark Dreyfus or not. My take here is, number one, the person who was behind this, at least ostensibly, clearly put a target on his back. But then I had a different thought after talking to a couple of people, and that this was all done not because of Labour in Victoria and the right faction of Labour in Victoria versus the right faction of Labour in New South Wales, but rather that Albanese is all behind this. And I think this is just as plausible as Richard Marles trying to exercise power within the Labour Party itself. So I don't know what your thoughts on all of this is, but I think both are equally plausible. And Albanese, with a great victory behind him, being the Machiavellian leader and essentially commandeering his right-hand person as the henchman in some sense. I find equally plausible that versus the henchman trying to position himself to stab Albanese in the back down the line. So who knows? Fun times in Australian politics.
Yeah, I mean, who can say what the reasons were? I mean, I do agree with you that off the back of such a persuasive and convincing electoral win, it's sort of the time to make these sort of moves where, you know, the government or the party's reputation feels a little bulletproof. That's not to say shots weren't fired. Ed Husic appeared on Q&A on the national broadcaster shortly after and was very frank about his view, the role that factional politics had played in his and Mark Dreyfus's ousting, and had some choice words about Mark Dreyfus's, the AG's ousting in particular. He said it was gratuitous. Yeah, Ed Husic's both a young member of parliament and one with a lot of experience. He has a wealth of experience in state politics before joining the federal Labor Party as well. So, yeah, and funny for you to call Anthony Albanese Machiavellian. He doesn't strike me as a Machiavellian kind of leader. He strikes me as charismatic, idealistic, emotional. I think
there's so many things I could say to that, right?
Chalmers says he wears his heart on his sleeve, right? Which is not something you tend to say about the prince.
No, but I also think that politicians play public roles and they may have different characteristics inside. I, for one, would not necessarily say that Anthony Albanese is particularly charismatic. I do think that he has come up through Labour politics, and that's a hard road to hew in pretty much any social democratic Labour environment. And I do think that that infighting prepares you almost to be the prince, the Machiavellian prince, if you will. But let's leave it there. We'll see what happens in the next few years. It certainly seems this particular topic has stirred quite a number of our listeners and viewers. So please leave your comments as you have in the past. We certainly read them all and respond to most of them. So we'll see where politics goes in Australia and whether it matters at all on the international stage.
We'll have to see if we're covering the reconciliation of the coalition in 2 weeks' time.
Well, and the reconciliation of some sort of the Labour Party. We'll see.
Well, let's get on to our topic for today. We're talking about artificial intelligence, one of my favorite topics, or at least one that seems to occupy a lot of my thinking time these days. I do think, though not many people agree with me outside of the tech bubble, that artificial intelligence is probably one of the most pressing social, economic, and political issues of our time. And we're talking about it today in the context of the legal profession, which is fitting given mine and Marcus's backgrounds. And I'm excited to be, rarely on this show, where we've often talked about German politics and tariffs. I'm excited to be in the role of the expert, or the relative expert, I should say.
Look, I think this is a fascinating topic. My foray into AI and the law started in 2009 when I was talking about autonomous weapon systems, and have stayed connected as closely as possible ever since. I've shifted over to trade, or I've always had these sort of two legs. But it's sort of interesting because there's this very positive story, of course, to tell about what AI, whatever that means from my perspective, because I don't think it's certainly artificial, but I query whether it's particularly intelligent. What AI means for the wider world, but also what it means for the way that we think about law, how we practice law, how we apply it, and to what extent we can rely on it, attribution questions, agency, and all sorts of things that are connected with that. We see huge amounts of investments, of course, but there's also huge amounts of challenges. So I think that's what we want to talk about today. Between the two of us, David's clearly much more in the trenches than I am on this topic. So take it away. Where are we going from here?
And this is really a conversation, and I think this is the place to start the conversation, this is really not so much a conversation about AI in the legal profession, but a conversation about AI through the lens of the legal profession. Yeah. Because what's happening in the legal profession and how AI is being used to automate or assist legal work is a bit of a microcosm for how we can think about AI in the knowledge economy, or indeed the economy as a whole. We have safety issues with high-risk applications of artificial intelligence. We have practical scenarios where hallucinations matter and where they don't. We have a large volume of unstructured text and a profession that heretofore was largely occupied with interpreting that unstructured text without the aid of technology. We have a lot of investor money, as you said, flowing into the sector, where previously there was not so much interest from investors in legal technology. And all of these are not unique issues to the legal profession, but it's interesting that they all kind of coalesce and arise all together in the legal profession. I think that's why it's such an interesting case study. I should make some disclaimers or caveats before we get started. Obviously, my day job, I run a legal technology company that uses artificial intelligence, including generative AI products, to deliver services for law firms and other organizations involved in law and justice. But I said I've been thinking about this topic a lot. It's been occupying my thoughts a lot. And two pieces of work that have helped to shape my thinking about this topic over the last few months. Two papers that I've spoken about on this show in previous episodes. AI 2027, which is a kind of accelerationist, perhaps even science fiction-y picture of what advances in artificial intelligence could look like as early as the end of this decade. And on the other end of the spectrum, Arvind Narayanan and Suresh Kapoor's paper, AI as Normal Technology, a vision of artificial intelligence seen through the lens of all of the practical challenges of adopting and diffusing technology throughout the economy that we've experienced with everything, from the personal computer to the internet to the mobile phone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these are sort of two ends of a spectrum in terms of predictions about the pace at which and the gravity of which the impact of artificial intelligence will be felt in the economy and in society. Daniel Cocotello, his paper AI 2027, predicts a potentially existential threat to the human race by the end of the decade. Arvind Narayanan predicts decades before we really see meaningful economic impacts from artificial intelligence. So very different pictures of the future.
In my space of autonomous weapon systems, we've had that same discussion since 2009. It's literally will come next year. And it always comes next year. And we haven't had it yet. And so I think that's sort of what you're talking about of sort of spectrum. One side says, well, we need to at least prepare for it. My question then is that just sort of crying wolf all the time in order to gain attention, or is that meant as a serious warning that the paper clips could take over the world?
Yeah, so it's always coming next year has been a theme in self-driving cars.
Yep.
You know, Tesla is always a year away from releasing the self-driving car. I feel like we're almost there now with, Waymo's operating largely without incident in San Francisco, for example, but that's far from, national or global scale. And then the flying car is, of course, the famous example made popular by Peter Thiel. When's my flying car coming? And that really speaks to this issue that Arvind Narayanan, I think, articulates really well in his paper, AI as Normal Technology, which is the difference between AI capability and the diffusion of AI and the implementation of that capability in the economy in real-world scenarios, as opposed to in benchmarking tests. And again, these are observations about the economy more generally, but it really seems to be, again, something that can be really keenly observed in law. And Narayanan does specifically look at law as a helpful illustrative case in his paper, where he talks about GPT-4 having a very impressive score on the bar exam. The headline even there is a little bit more complex than it sounds. It has a very impressive score on the multiple choice part of the bar exam, and less so on the long form writing, where it scored quite poorly.
Hey, just on the inside, I think they used the second round of, it's always a comparative exercise. And I think the bar exam that they tested this in was the second round, namely the people who failed the first time around. So the really good candidates had already come out, and therefore they scored fairly high. So I think they, by dint of when they ran the test, almost artificially inflated the score that they achieved in comparison to the people who took it. Which I think was a bit backhanded, frankly.
Yes, but the kind of buried lead, I suppose, I'm going to quote from the paper now because Arvind explains it much better than I could. While GPT-4 reportedly achieved scores in the top 10% of bar exam test takers, this tells us remarkably little about AI's ability to practice law. The bar exam emphasizes subject matter knowledge and underemphasizes real-world skills that are harder to measure in a standardized computer-administered format.
Yep.
It emphasizes precisely what language models are good at, retrieving and applying memorized information. And I think when I speak to lawyers about artificial intelligence, I hear, well, three possible responses. One, I'm not really thinking about it at all because I have much more important things to think about, and I'd like to go and do those now, please, and stop talking to you. The other is I'm really worried about my job and the jobs of all of my colleagues, all the junior lawyers. I'm worried about mass job replacement in the legal industry. How are new law graduates going to get trained, et cetera, et cetera?
Yep.
And then the not us logic, well, although it will replace lots of people in other professions, it will never replace me or the kind of lawyers who do the work I do. That's kind of the three responses that we tend to get. And I think I, for my own part, tend to vacillate between these ends of the spectrum, where I worry about a shrinking legal profession, or at least one that perhaps doesn't grow at the rate that it once did, and not being particularly worried about that at all for a few different reasons. But what we're certainly seeing in the market is claims that this sort of job replacement, that this human obsolescence is kind of already here or about to arrive, right? The buy now, pay later company Klarna announced last year that it wasn't going to employ any more customer service agents. It was going to put it all on AI. Its CEO said that AI can already do all of the jobs a human can do, which was an extraordinary claim. But when we sort of step back from the marketing hype of the foundational model companies, we see this adoption gap, this gap between the capabilities observed in benchmarking tests and the realities of, a messy, dynamic, unpredictable, multivariate world. The most recent paper on this is a May 2025 IBM study. It found that about 25% of corporate AI initiatives delivered their expected return on investment, compared to 64% of leaders of those organizations, CEOs, saying that they adopt AI projects before they really have an understanding of the value they'll deliver. So I think that says a lot about the motivations, perhaps, for adopting this technology, and about the motivations for making some of the futurist claims about what it's going to do. We don't sure exactly what value this project's going to deliver, but if it's going to completely render all humans in the economy obsolete in the next 3 years, we'd better pursue it now, right? We don't want to miss out. Even some fairly bullish analysts on the topic of the impact of AI in the economy and how quickly that would happen have changed their tune. Goldman Sachs were one of the first analysts to predict that nearly half of tasks performed by lawyers specifically could be automated by AI. A year later, Goldman Sachs published a paper entitled "Too Much Spend, Too Little Benefit," predicting that they expect the productivity and GDP gains from AI to be something like 0.5% over the next decade and 1% over the next decade, respectively. So there is a counter-narrative, I suppose, to these sort of urgent suggestions that we're all going to be replaced by robots. But it's sort of remarkable to me that we see such different visions of the future in the same breath so often.
Yeah, this very much is in line with what sort of my observations were in the autonomous weapon system space. I think the bit that really convinced me about the Narayanan and Kapoor paper was that, again, similar to what happened in the autonomous weapons system area, was number one, the uptake is going to be much slower than proponents predict. I think we're sort of there. And I want to get to that in a moment in a bit more depth. And then there's the safety criticality of areas. And I think this is where law comes sort of as a relatively conservative, if you will, area of if you look at different professions, as a relatively conservative profession, I think is maybe a bit more critical, is also bound by certain rules that where lawyers are held to account for certain things. It's much easier, if you will, to be a tech entrepreneur and claim all sorts of things because you want venture capital money. You're held to account by bar associations or by law societies or by the courts in order to not overstep nearly as much. And I think that contributes to a little bit less of moving fast and break things, but rather hasten deliberately or hasten slowly. And we see this in some of these large consulting companies, even a couple of years ago, saying, you need to do this now, as opposed to the legal profession. Bain has a really good overview that basically the legal profession was sort of seen in the middle of the pack with respect to saying, well, AI use is either met or exceeded, and that has gone completely backwards, whereas some other places have gone forward. And I think that's one way to think about this. And then there's all these institutional, organizational, and human elements where law really is deeply entrenched, and where I think technology is being seen seen as the be-all and end-all, but very quickly runs into the messy sort of ordinariness of life. And therefore, I think the economic impacts are much more gradual than what some people might think it is. So for law and lawyers, I think that means that relatively easy tasks where you throw data and can throw data at a problem, I think are sort of early harvest, easy to grab. But once it becomes messy and complicated, it's only a preparatory stage for the actual work to be done by lawyers.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I mentioned in the disclaimer that I run a company called Lext, which makes some of these tools for lawyers. And one of those automates the review of what we call sort of the high volume but fairly low risk classes of contracts, the sorts of things that are reviewed in their hundreds every month by large law firms. And these are the sorts of tasks that kind of already are reading comprehension exercises. They have, one might say, right and wrong answers, and they can be verified as right and wrong fairly quickly. There is absolutely a productivity gain there for a particular kind of law practice, doing a particular kind of task. But there are tasks that are strategic, that high risk, about which reasonable minds can differ, which involve an application of argument, maybe even philosophy, rather than just the application of true or false. Talking about things like preparing filings, creating a case theory and expressing that in a pleading, even drafting evidence, where I think the gap between what lawyers expect a tool that could do this is producing and what a human lawyer produces, the gap is still quite large.
I've looked at some of these tools, and I must say, I find many of them quite underwhelming. That might change in the future, but that's the dirty, sort of dull work that I think these tools are supposed to do, which is fine because, as you say, they're relatively low risk. Once you get into the higher risk element, then I think these tools are hopefully, at least for the time being, not going to be used as much. And I think we see this, at least from public institutions, we'll get to them in a moment. I think we see that hesitation even more so than in the private law firms. We see public institutions being much more cautious about their use because it really seems to matter much more in terms of accountability for public institutions and specifically for the courts.
Yeah. And, Henry Ford said that, if he had asked the public what he should make, they would have said, make a faster horse instead of a car. But this heuristic about, you should build the car instead of the faster horse, I think has been a little bit harmful in some cases when we think about innovation in law, because a lot of the great use cases for generative AI and large language models in law tend to be faster horses. When I think about our own solution, contract review automation, this is the review of contracts that's kind of already been subject to some pressures to commoditize, to reduce price, to find organizational efficiencies in other ways. These are the sorts of tasks that legal process outsourcing was spruiked as a solution for 10 years ago. That's the solution, if you're unfamiliar with it, of engaging lawyers in lower cost jurisdictions that share some cultural, political and social similarities to a jurisdiction like Australia. For example, lawyers in South Africa to review documents for an Australian law firm on an outsourced basis. It's also the sort of task that deep learning models, which although very rigid and expensive to train and not as dynamic or open-ended as large language models, were used to do similar contract review tasks around sort of 2015, 2016. So these are sort of faster horse examples, right? There are already use cases where we've seen a potential for automation, a potential for technology-based efficiencies. And that's where the benefit is being found. Again, the big global incumbents, Thomson Reuters, LexisNexis, have generative AI-based solutions. They are solutions for performing legal research, something that has been assisted by search algorithms for many years. And using generative AI is at least meant to be a improvement on that experience and a better way to search.
Yeah, I mean, that discussion reminds me a little bit of sort of the question of use case. And the use case for, again, draw from my experience on autonomous weapon systems. It's great to use certain tools for certain things, but some of them are far too expensive to use, or they're not the right tool for the job. And you can achieve the same result with something that's far less intrusive, but it doesn't make any news and doesn't make any waves. And it seems to me that oftentimes we see this push for greater technological prowess to be used, be seen as on the front end, but on the other side, sometimes the boring stuff is just that. It's boring and you need to do it. And the question is, can you use a tool to make this more efficient? And in that case, by all means, go ahead. But I think the difference that oftentimes comes about in these questions is that different professions are held to different standards. And the legal profession, I think, is much more cautious in this space because their standards are, I wouldn't say necessarily higher, but there are really rigid standards that they're being held to account for. And that's why I think you see this reduction, if you will, in the speed with which said maybe a couple of years ago would have said, yes, we're going full steam ahead. We're not doing this nearly as much anymore. I might suggest that we go ahead to the public perception issue, because I think the public's view of all of this is something that oftentimes lawyers overlook.
I know the study you're talking about. I go ahead and summarize it, but I have some thoughts about it that I think can change the lens through which you look at the results. But go ahead.
Yeah, so, well, I'll say something about this in a second. But the funny thing is that I put this particular study through ChatGPT and asked for a summary, and it came up with completely wrong numbers and completely wrong locations as to where the participants in the study were based. So there's 288 people that were were asked to rate the trustworthiness, if you will, and accuracy of legal advice in various scenarios. I think it was employment law, landlord-tenant issues, contract disputes, and so forth. And not an overwhelming majority, but a majority of participants seem to trust the results of the large language model much more so than that of a lawyer. And they weren't told which one was which initially. And when they were told that this legal advice had been generated by a large language model, their trust even increased by 12% to when they were told the advice came from a human lawyer. So that's, I think, the rough setup. We'll link to that paper in the show notes. But you apparently have a completely different take. We didn't discuss this before, so eviscerate the paper, if you will.
It's not so much to eviscerate the paper, but just to make an observation about the experiment design and what you might draw from how this was presented. So the participants in the study were given questions and answers to those questions and asked to rate them, right? And this study was published right around the time, maybe some of our listeners will be familiar with it, OpenAI rolled back a update to one of its flagship large language models on the basis that the model was too sycophantic. In other words, that it told you what you wanted to hear, fawned over you. If you had asked this model of OpenAI's if you were the most interesting person it had ever spoken to, it would unfailingly say, yes, you are the most interesting, intelligent person that I've ever spoken to in my life. And this sycophancy, maybe overtuned in the particular model that OpenAI rolled back, is still a feature of most large language models. We can see sycophancy observed in less overt fawning ways in that the content of a prompt can influence the output. If you express an opinion that 1 + 1 is 3, a model might be more likely to agree with you on that conclusion, even if it's not overtly saying it's doing that because it agrees with you. It's a next token predictor. And if there's an expression of opinion about the state of the world and the true state of affairs earlier in the sequence of tokens, well, the next prediction about that sequence of tokens is more likely to be consistent with the earlier token sequence than it is likely to be inconsistent with it. So whether or not that has a level of sycophancy that, expresses itself in something that needs to be rolled back by one of the companies, these models are sycophantic. And when you ask them a question, maybe you have I'm certainly not suggesting that anyone ask ChatGPT for legal advice. I think it's a bad idea. But if you were to ask it a legal question, it's not going to ask you any questions. It's just going to give you an answer, nice and confident, nice and succinct. And it's not going to really couch that in any conditions or caveats or, well, it depends on this or that. Large language models are really good at telling you what you want to hear. I'm not surprised that people liked the answer better because it tends to be confident whether or not it's complete or right. And it tends to be consistent with the original request, right? If you say, can I do this? It's probably going to say yes, and here's how, rather than I wouldn't do that. I just last week went up to the Supreme Court to move the admission of a new lawyer. And on that occasion, the Chief Justice of the court gives a speech. And in that speech, he said that new lawyers have to resist the temptation to tell their clients what they want to hear. And at the end of the day, not even the client will thank you for that in the long run. And that's because good advice is often not welcome advice. Often it's difficult news, but large language models aren't so good at giving that. And they're also not so good at contextualizing their answers. So I read some of the human written responses of that study. They are replete with conditions and I'm assuming this, but tell me if it's wrong. And, maybe this, maybe that. So I think sycophancy, the kind of persuasive, confident, but perhaps incompleteness of large language model outputs is something to factor in here. But I will readily admit, so too is the tendency of some lawyers to write for other lawyers rather than their clients, to write in legalese, to not be terribly concerned about the interpretability or the ease of use of their advice. Those are all legitimate criticisms. But we should be aware of the other side of that coin. The last observation I would make is I think it was really interesting in this study that participants were asked to rate the accuracy of the advice, despite they themselves not being in a position to opine on whether it was accurate. This idea of accuracy as a subjective matter that you could opine on is interesting. And again, I'm not surprised that they rated it as more accurate because it was probably expressed with more confidence.
There was a lot in there, David, and I think there's a lot more to think about. Number one, the way the studies are done, but also, is there enough time to think about the consequences of what we're doing, essentially? And I think that's where the direction of travel is. Now, clearly, government is thinking about this a little bit more carefully than the private sector because the private sector is driven by different incentives. And we've had a quick look around various courts around the world. And for the most part, I think the approach to me seems sensible. You, the lawyer, are responsible for whatever you're submitting. Be careful what you're using it for. Be careful of privacy concerns when you're submitting information to large language models that are not specifically tailored towards you and don't have privacy protections built into it. I think that's incredibly important and I think all too often overlooked. Now, David, at the end, I think you've already sort of said this. Where do you see the direction for travel for AI on the spectrum from nothing's changing whatsoever and AI will take over from the lawyers? I suspect you are somewhere in the middle, but which side on the middle are you leaning towards?
I don't know that I'm so much in the middle as I find myself on one end of the spectrum or the other, depending on the time of day and if I've eaten lunch or not. And it's a difficult time to make predictions about the future. Well, what time isn't?
That was true all the time.
And I guess all futures are plausible. I do want to leave our listeners with a bit of a balm, though. If you're a lawyer or any kind of knowledge worker worried about being replaced by AI, I just want you to think about this, right? I think the people who are concerned about job replacement or job obsolescence are not really thinking big enough about that scenario being true. If artificial intelligence can automate so many of a lawyer's tasks as to replace them, then it's replacing software engineers, it's replacing product managers, it's replacing accountants, it's replacing forensic analysts, it's replacing actuaries, it's replacing just about every knowledge worker, right? If we sort of take a category of knowledge worker and say, well, all of the work they do in a messy, multivariate, dynamic world can be automated by AI, then that's probably true of every other profession also. At which point you don't really have to worry about your job. Everyone's out of a job. And then we don't really have to worry so much about whether or not our job is safe, but how we make meaning in our lives and how we construct an identity for ourselves that isn't built around our work. That's if you believe that future is on the horizon. Don't know that's going to come. I think if there is a job threat or job replacement coming for law firms, it's a very specific kind of practice. We talk about this concern that junior lawyers cut their teeth on repetitive tasks that may be low-hanging fruit, or if not low-hanging fruit, at least possible use cases for artificial intelligence. I described the document review task that my company seeks to automate as one of those. And we sometimes worry, well, what are these junior lawyers going to do to learn their trade? And if that were a large swathe of the profession, I could certainly see a reduction in roles for junior lawyers, and we might worry about where we get the rest of them in the future. But my observation, having practiced for many years, is that many junior lawyers do the sort of work that senior lawyers do, only under supervision and with guidance and with assistance. And that's because many junior lawyers don't work in these very large law firms that have volume-based practices. They work in government agencies or in corporates or in suburban and regional practices, or even in highly specialized teams in large law practices that don't do high volume commoditized work. And maybe this is translatable into other areas of knowledge work, to start rethinking how we train young knowledge workers. As a law student who's starting law school today, or a law graduate who's about to join the profession, I would be optimistic about the future. I would be optimistic that I might not actually spend a year of my life chained to a photocopier, as some of your predecessors have, and that you might get to do some more interesting work than maybe you were expecting to.
Well, that's a heartening thought towards the end. My own take is that we'll just have to probably wait and see. I don't think the lawyers that AI will take over, but that it will very slowly and over time creep into ever more spaces, essentially. And that's, again, the prediction that we see in the military realm, or whether we look at self-driving cars. It's a much more gradual approach than I think some of the headlines would make you think. And in that sense, I'm, as always, an incrementalist, which is on the boring side of things. But I think that's probably the direction of travel for me. My own vision, if you will, would always be that law should not be at the tail end of that experience, but try to shape not only the regulation of the legal profession, but also the regulation of AI in other parts of professions. And think about the trade-offs, where there's real advantages, but where there's also some risk, and try to figure out how one can think about this from the front end rather than the tail end. So, as always, David, let's try to end on a lighter note. And I think we're going to have to talk about the elephant in the room, if you will, that scene of...
the jumbo in the room, yeah.
A jumbo in the room. Thank you. The jumbo in the room. The plane for Donald Trump. So as most listeners will have seen by now.
Qatar Force One.
Well, Qatar Force One or Air Force One, that video that Donald Trump would accept a particular plane. I think the story is much more complicated by now, because as of today, it seems like that the US government has actually asked Boeing to identify planes that would fit the bill. And Qatar's royal family had one of those planes and then was approached by the US Air Force whether they would be willing to lend the plane, lease the plane, sell the plane in some way, shape, or form. Over to you. Take it away for now, David. What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, well, look, I think like a lot of these stories as part of the flood the zone narrative of, confusing and bewildering us with red herrings in the Trump administration, it's probably less exciting or impactful as we're meant to make it out to be. I think we're supposed to be outraged by the blatant corruption. But then in reality, once things come to detail and implementation, it's not very impactful at all. For one, the plane, although very nice and needs a major security overhaul, the Secret Service has to have their close look at it. I understand it's sitting in San Antonio awaiting its security review. And by the time it's refactored by the Secret Service and the military, it's probably not going to be ready for use until Donald Trump is no longer president. I think like many of these flood the zone strategy kind of stories, there's less going on than it looks.
Yeah, that's probably right. I'm going to keep my remarks brief. Number one, I think the perception is awful. Obviously, process matters. Donald Trump doesn't seem to care about the process, and the process will come back to bite in some sense because, as you said, making this plane security-proof and refitting it with all the things and trappings that an Air Force One, whatever that means, technologically is going to take much longer. The thing that then really worries me is much more Donald Trump will have a new plane because it's gifted to his library, over which he has much more control rather than. I'm trying to figure out whether this is a distraction, as you said, flooding the zone. This is how we started our podcast. Or whether there's a real there. So we'll just have to see where that goes. It's maybe much less of a lighter note than we ordinarily do, but it was just one of those things when I first heard about it.
For a lighter note these days?
Well, it does. But it's one of those things that you just can't get past almost because it's just so outrageous. At first blush, at second blush, and even at third blush. But in the grander scheme of things of what's happening in the US, it does pass for a lighter note. So I think on that note, we can end it. David, thanks so much for doing this again. And we'll be back in 2 weeks.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Markus.
Take care. The Civic Podcast is presented by David Turner and myself, Markus Wagner. Help us spread the word by telling others about the podcast. For more information, visit us on thecivicpodcast.com. Our handle on the socials is the Civic Podcast. The production team consists of Irene Bijou, Justin Bortignon, Jacqueline Malafay, and Jacob Malby. On behalf of David Turner and myself, thank you for listening.